Okay, thank you, Sarah, and thank you to CFCA. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all. I should preface, we're going to go over the NPRM and what some of the implications that the NPRM could mean. None of this is legal advice. You should always reach out to your regulatory counsel and see how these particular rules may impact your company in your products. So looking forward to the conversation. Okay, well, let's get started. So as Sarah mentioned, this presentation is going to focus on the FCC's NPRM entitled Combating Illegal Robocalls Through FCC Numbering Policies. I'm not going to give you all of the dockets because we'll be here forever, but the NPRM was adopted on March 26th, released on March 27th, and was later released in the Federal Register. So we have comments coming up. So comments are due June 8th, and then reply comments are due July 7th. So you may be spending your 4th of July holiday reviewing comments and finalizing your reply comments. At a very high level, the FCC is making a fundamental shift in how it approaches robocall enforcement. Rather than focusing only on call content, delivery, and downstream blocking, the Commission seems to be moving upstream to the point where illegal robocalls often begin access to telephone numbers. The FCC describes this proceeding as targeting the very first stage of the call path, numbering, because bad actors' efforts to deceive consumers often start with obtaining and using telephone numbers. The FCC's framing of this is pretty important. Numbering resources are no longer being treated as neutral infrastructure or merely an efficiency and a conservation issue. The NPRM treats numbering as a trust asset, a limited public resource, and links misuse of numbers directly to consumer harm and fraud. The key FCC recommendations fall into several buckets, which we'll go into detail. First, the FCC proposes to expand robocall-related certification and disclosure obligations beyond interconnected VoIP providers that have direct access to numbering. The proposal would apply these obligations to all service providers that are receiving numbering resources directly from NAMPA. And the other key point, which we'll get into, is those obligations for certifications may also apply to resellers of telephone numbers. Second, the FCC proposes to strengthen NRUF reporting so regulators have better visibility into how numbers are being assigned, resold, and used. In particular, the NPRM focuses on intermediate numbers and proposes more granular reporting categories. Third, the FCC seeks comment on whether to limit the resale of numbering resources to a single level, because multi-layer resale can obscure which party is actually using the phone number and can delay enforcement investigations. Fourth, the FCC directly addresses number cycling or number rotation, the use of large quantities of numbers on a rotating short-term or even single-use basis to evade analytics and blocking tools. The Commission is seeking comment on whether this practice should be limited or prohibited, while also acknowledging that there are legitimate reasons for rotating numbers. Finally, the FCC is looking at ways to empower state commissions and the numbering administrators with better access to data and faster tools to identify misuse, withhold numbering resources, and support enforcement. So let's get into it. Why did the FCC turn to numbering? While they make clear, right, that it's not starting from scratch, the FCC already has deployed a multi-pronged robocall mitigation framework that I know many in CFCA are very familiar with, right? These include stir shake-in, authentication, expanded call blocking, traceback requirements, and robocall mitigation plans. However, the Commission is very clear that these tools have not eliminated the problem. Robocalls remain persistent, and the FCC's enforcement experience has shown that existing downstream interventions are not sufficient on their own. So the NPRM points to structural challenges in the communication network, right? They're looking at legacy circuit switch networks, but they're also seeing that there's multiple provider types, that we're moving to an IP-based network, right? And we have that other NPRM looking to go all IP by 2028, as well as complicated wholesale and resale relationships. And as a result, numbering resources are often assigned indirectly. They pass through wholesalers and resellers before reaching the end user. And so in these cases, the entity that receives the numbers from the numbering administrator is not the entity actually using them or originating the calls. And that produces an enforcement challenge, right? There's delayed traceback and delayed investigation efforts. And so the NPRM repeatedly notes that resale numbers show up in a majority of major robocall investigations. So figuring out a solution to the number allocation issue could really help in terms of FCC enforcement. So additionally, right, kind of jumping from why numbering, for those exact reasons, we need to explore why is this going beyond service providers, right? As we said, enterprises and downstream players are coming into focus. High volume outbound calling environments like enterprise contact centers, CPaaS platforms, and customer engagement systems directly shape how numbers are used. So they indicate, right, how frequently numbers are used, whether numbers are rotated or reused, how long numbers remain assigned, and how calling patterns appear to analytics engines. And so even though these entities are not the primary regulated party in the NPRM, their operational, okay, I just got an alert, of course, that my computer may restart, so hopefully that does not happen. But as providers become more accountable for how numbering resources are used, they will need to increase monitoring of their customers, tighten acceptable use policies, and potentially restrict certain behaviors like short-term numbering use. So enterprises that rely on these high volume outbound calling, dynamic number assignment or number rotation services may see new contractual requirements, greater scrutiny of their calling patterns, and increased expectations about number stability, transparency, and traceability. So ultimately, the NPRM signals that number trust is no longer just a provider issue. It's an ecosystem-wide responsibility. The entities that influence how numbers behave, whether regulated directly or not, will increasingly be expected to align these behaviors with regulatory goals around transparency, accountability, and consumer protection. So let's dive into each of these 5 pillars to see what the FCC is actually recommending. One of the clearest and most immediate signals in the NPRM is the expansion of certification obligations. The FCC proposes extending robocall-related certifications to all providers that receive numbering resources directly from NAMPA, as well as to resellers that provision numbers downstream. This is fundamentally about closing gaps in who is accountable for numbering resources. Today, only a relatively narrow group of providers, primarily interconnected VoIP providers, are required to make these certifications. The FCC's proposal would level that regulatory playing field. One of the most important shifts here is that the certifications are no longer tied only to call origination or network behavior. Instead, they're being tied to the right to obtain and hold telephone numbers. And this means that compliance starts much earlier. It starts at the point of requesting the numbering resources and continues throughout the life cycle of how those numbers are being used. These certifications are not symbolic or procedural, right? They are affirmative regulatory representations. And because they're formal certifications, they become a basis for enforcement action if they're inaccurate or misleading. And they become a mechanism for the FCC to hold entities accountable before and after harm occurs. Another major shift is that wholesale and resale relationships are pulled directly into the compliance parameter. So historically, these relationships were treated largely as commercial arrangements with limited regulatory visibility into how numbers were being used downstream. And under the FCC's current proposal, the providers must understand who they're giving numbers to. They have to have visibility into how those numbers are being used. And they must be able to stand behind the usage of those numbers when making these certifications. So it's a really big operational change for those that have direct access to numbering, right? You're going to have to establish internal controls around number assignment and distribution. You might have to expand monitoring capabilities to track how numbers are being used over time. In addition, you're going to have to understand documentation and audit readiness to support certifications in the event of regulatory scrutiny or questioning. Moving on to the second pillar, right? If the first pillar is all about accountability at the point of access, this second pillar is all about visibility over time. And the FCC is pretty explicit that the NRUF, which is the numbering resource utilization and forecast report, is no longer just a planning tool, right? Historically, NRUF was used to track number utilization, prevent exhaustion of numbering resources, and support area code and inventory management. But the FCC is repositioning the NRUF as a core enforcement and oversight mechanism. And why that shift matters is because it's really driven by the core FCC problem that they've identified, which is the lack of visibility in how numbers are being used after they're assigned. There is a particular focus on intermediate numbers. At the center of the proposal is this concept that intermediate numbers are those that are not yet assigned to an end user but have been passed to another provider or reseller. And the FCC identifies these intermediate numbers as the critical visibility gap because they represent the point where numbers leave the provider of record and go into the wholesale and resale ecosystem. The NPRM highlights several issues with NRUF that many industry groups, including the NANCI, took a look at for NRUF reporting. These include inconsistent categorization and interpretation of that intermediate number definition and obligation, in addition to the lack of clarity of how to report these resale and sub-allocation relationships. In many cases, providers either don't know how their numbers are being used downstream or lack systems and processes to capture that detailed information. So to address this, the FCC is proposing to significantly increase the granularity of the NRUF. And they're looking to break up the intermediate number category into 3 subcategories. And these would be intermediate assigned, intermediate other, and intermediate available. But the more important shift is that it is much more than just the structural. It's that the provider of record would be responsible for knowing how its numbers are being used downstream. And providers must collect that information from resellers, and failure to do so could result in deficient reporting. In addition, the FCC is asking whether resellers themselves should be required to file NRUF reports, and they would report on how they're using the numbers. They would identify who they're getting the numbers from, and it would allow the regulators to cross-check reporting across this chain of custody. And then the implication for providers, right? This would really become a governance requirement. So as previously said, this would have, obligations added to your numbering folks so that they know the visibility of the numbers within the wholesale and resale relationships, that they can collect and validate that downstream data, and that, as they file these reports and as they're signing these certifications, they have confidence in the data they're relying on to do so. The next numbering question that the FCC is asking about is resale. The NPRM highlights that numbers today often move through that multi-layer wholesale relationship, and that this creates real-world challenges in terms of traceback investigations, enforcement actions, and bad actors can exploit this opaquity to persist in the system. And so the core question becomes, should the resale of numbering resources be limited to a single level? And under this concept, a provider receiving numbers could sell directly to end users, but they cannot resell those numbers to another reseller. So the goal would be to shorten that chain of custody, make relationships more transparent, and enable faster identification for responsible parties. It is important to note that the FCC does acknowledge that this reseller issue is not simple. Resale today plays an important role in competition and service delivery. It supports different business models, including CPaaS and wholesale services, and is deeply enabled in the current ecosystem. So the Commission is not treating this as a foregone conclusion of that they're going to proceed with this recommendation, but they do see it as a trade-off of transparency and enforceability versus flexibility in market competition structure. So even if the FCC does not ultimately impose a hard single level restriction, the direction is very clear, right? That opaque multi-layer resale structures will face increasing scrutiny, and providers will be expected to demonstrate clear visibility into their resale chains. The fourth pillar that the FCC addresses is number cycling. And the FCC defines number cycling as the use of numbers of large volumes that are rotated quickly, sometimes after just 1 or 2 calls, and often can be used on a single use basis. And so the goal is simple. Systems that relies on reputation, call volume, patterns, or repeat usage, it can't operate well in this kind of one and done ecosystem. And so if every call comes from a new number, right, analytics can't build a risk profile, blocking systems struggle to keep up, and abusive traffic can persist much longer. And even more importantly, right, these calls can still receive false or shaken authentication because authentication verifies who is using the number and not whether that behavior is legitimate. So you end up with this critical gap, right? Calls are technically authenticated, but still being abused. And so the FCC also highlights how large scale this problem can be. In enforcement cases, robocalling campaigns have used millions of numbers, with a significant percentage of those numbers only being used once. And at that scale, blocking becomes irrelevant, resources are being misused, and traceback becomes extremely more complex. What makes this issue more nuanced is there are legitimate use cases. Number cycling isn't always malicious. The commission explicitly acknowledges, that there are some use cases that do rely on number cycling. For example, enterprises may rotate numbers to maintain connection rates. Contact centers may cycle numbers to avoid blocking. So the FCC recognizes this tension. They are looking to seek comment on whether number cycling should be prohibited or limited. And are there ways to distinguish between legitimate high volume calling from that abusive cycling of numbers? So they are looking for that input in the comment period starting in June. The final pillar here is the FCC is trying to seek ways to empower states themselves and NAMPA to take action. So, up to this point, we've talked about who is accountable and how visibility can be improved. But now the FCC is trying to figure out who can act and how quickly can they act when problems are identified. The FCC explicitly recognizes that state commissions and NAMPA may be the first to see signs of misuse. And as a result, the NPRM is looking to expand their role from passive data recipients to active participants in enforcement. And so one key proposal is to give state regulators broader access to NRUF data, including potentially out-of-state data and more detailed provider-specific information. And the goal is to allow states to identify patterns of misuse across jurisdictions to better understand how numbers are being used nationally and not just locally, and collaborate more effectively with the FCC on investigations. And even more significant, the FCC is considering whether to give states greater authority to intervene directly. Today, withholding number and resources is primarily handled by, the FCC, NAMPA, in the states in certain circumstances. But here, the NPRM asks whether states should be able to direct the withholding of number and resources for providers that fail to file accurate NRUF data, show signs of misuse, or violate FCC rules. And so that's definitely a big shift. So putting this all together briefly, but before we move on to kind of actionable steps that can be taken, this particular recommendation or area of seeking comment is trying to get faster escalation, right? They're moving from detection to restriction at a quicker rate. And so providers and resellers in those you resell to your enterprise customers need to be prepared to share information, right? to be able to respond to potentially quicker regulatory inquiry. So that ultimately becomes the main crux of all of these 5 pillars coming together. So to kind of hit that nail on the head, right? Everything we've covered up to that point, certifications, NRUF reporting, resale scrutiny, number cycling, and expanded enforcement converges on a single expectation. And that's that organizations must be able to demonstrate responsible stewardship of number and resources over time. So with that picture in mind, what can you do, right? What CNS has been working with the industry for a while on various solutions, but I wanted to bring up 2 today. So the first is the Call Guardian Authentication Hub, right? We know at this point of the story that the FCC is raising the industry's, their expectations of the industry around identity, behavior, and accountability across the life cycle of numbers. And so Call Guardian Authentication Hub directly addresses the identity layer of that framework. Call Guardian supports the FCC's recommendations or inquiries goals by authenticating calls at origination and verifying that the caller has the right to use that number. In addition, they validate those calls at termination and assess whether incoming calls can be trusted. So this directly aligns with those stir-shaken authentication requirements from the FCC, which continue to remain a core pillar of robocall obligations. But from a compliance perspective, this capability can help organizations meet that caller authentication requirement, support the robocall mitigation platform obligations, and participate effectively in traceback efforts. And Call Guardian moves these capabilities from static compliance to real-time operational enforcement. Another key outcome related to Call Guardian is the reduction of spoofing and impersonation risk, which I know has been a hot topic for CFCA, especially at the March event in North Carolina, where we're partnering with banks and where spoofing and impersonation was one of their highest concerns. By establishing a trusted identity at both ends of the call, networks can make better decisions about call treatment. Providers can improve confidence in analytics and labeling, and consumers receive more transparent and trustworthy call experiences. And the key point, right, and we want to tie this back to the NPRM, is that authentication alone does not solve this entire problem, right? If you have a fully authenticated call, if that is still unwanted and abusive, what good does that authentication do? And this is especially true with the number of cycling scenarios that we went through. So Call Guardian answers that question of who is calling. And now we need to answer the question of how numbers are being used over time. So if you pair Call Guardian with True Number Protect, you are going to be in a much better position to meet some of the FCC's goals in terms of compliance with this NPRM. So this is exactly the gap, right, that the NPRM highlights throughout, right? It still indicates risk or misuse. Numbers may be validly obtained, but calls can be properly authenticated, but the behavior of those numbers can change and can change quite quickly. So True Number Protect directly addresses this need by providing intelligence on the status, validity, and behavior of the telephone number over time. It enables organizations to determine whether a number is valid allocated, or potentially misused. They can identify invalid, unallocated, and high-risk numbers, and they can detect abnormal usage patterns, including rapid turnover or inconsistent activity. And this directly aligns with the FCC's focus on improving visibility into how numbers are used after assignment and detecting that misuse in the life cycle. So with that, I've been talking for a while, but I wanted to try to prepare you with a checklist to take away from. As you're going through the NPRM, as you're drafting your comments and your reply comments, here are a few things, both operationally and I guess legally as well, right, that you want to keep in mind when approaching the FCC's questions. So first is, do you know who's using your numbers? Do you have clear visibility into your customers, your resellers, and your end users? Can you see how numbers are being used over time? Insight into usage patterns, duration, and behavior, and not just that one step of the assignment. Can you detect high-risk behavior? Or do you have the ability to identify things like number cycling, rapid turnover, or unusual patterns? Do you have contractual control over downstream use, right? Do you have policies in place, monitoring, and the ability to intervene when needed? Can you support certifications with evidence, right? Data, documentation, and controls will back up your compliance and your legal obligations to submit those certifications. And are you ready for faster enforcement? Do you have accurate data and the ability to respond quickly to regulatory inquiries? So compliance is no longer about having numbers. It's about proving you control how they're being used, right? The NPRM really does make one thing clear, and that's that numbering is no longer a neutral infrastructure. It's treated as a trust asset that must be used responsibly. Organizations that combine authentication with visibility into how numbers are used and that reduce reliance on opaque or disposable practices will be best positioned as the regulatory environment continues to evolve. So with that, I can open it up to Q&A. I'm sure everybody has questions, comments, thoughts. I may not be able to answer all questions, but it's the Teams meeting, thankfully, so maybe we can have more of a dialogue, which would be great.